August 12, 1945. On the volcanic soil of Guam, the jungle still hummed with cicadas as twilight settled over the island. A barbed wire enclosure stretched across the clearing, its watchtowers silhouetted against a fading orange sky. Inside, hundreds of weary Japanese prisoners sat in silence, their khaki uniforms torn, their faces thin and sunken from months of privation. Some stared at the ground, some murmured prayers, others fixed their eyes on the horizon where the ocean glowed with the last fire of the day. Then, almost without warning, American guards walked in, not with rifles raised, not with boots pounding, but with newspapers folded under their arms. They carried comics, magazines, even bundles of mail from home. The prisoners lifted their heads, eyes narrowing in disbelief. The very men who had fought them so fiercely in jungles and seas now extended newspapers, pages filled with smiling Hollywood actors, baseball box scores, and cartoons of mischievous boys and slapstick antics. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. It was a scene that did not fit the brutal logic of total war. The conquerors were sharing laughter. The silence inside the compound broke slowly. Some prisoners hesitated, afraid it might be a cruel trick. They had been told Americans were brutal, merciless, a people of steel and greed. Yet here, on this humid Pacific evening, their enemies placed fragile sheets of paper into their hands. The crinkle of newsprint replaced the usual rattle of tin mess kits and the distant rumble of trucks. A sergeant, his sleeves rolled high against the heat, handed a folded copy of the Stars and Stripes through the wire. The prisoner who received it trembled, staring at the English letters. Around him, others leaned close, pointing at the photographs of GIs grinning beside jeeps, or advertisements for chocolate bars and cigarettes. The guards explained in broken Japanese with gestures and smiles that these were American newspapers, brought to ease the long hours of captivity. They even held out comic books, brightly inked covers showing Superman lifting tanks or Donald Duck chasing after runaway hats. The effect was electric. Some prisoners, hardened infantrymen who had sworn to die rather than be captured, now found themselves laughing, not at their captors, but with them. The barbed wire still cut the night air between them, but for a fleeting instant it felt less like a cage and more like a curtain between two worlds. What shocked the prisoners was not the paper itself, but the spirit carried in its ink. In the Imperial Japanese Army, information had been rationed like food. Soldiers had marched through campaigns in China, Burma, and the Philippines with only the carefully crafted bulletins of Tokyo, each one stripped of doubt, filled with slogans of honor and sacrifice. To them, the newspaper was a weapon of the state, an iron tool to shape loyalty. But here, in American hands, news seemed something different, looser, freer, unpredictable. It contained victories and losses, politics and gossip, the mundane rhythm of a civilian life untouched by shells and shrapnel. To hold such a paper was to glimpse a society that had not been devoured entirely by war. To see comics tucked beside headlines was, to many prisoners, incomprehensible. Humor in the midst of global conflict, laughter while fleets clashed and cities burned. It was alien, and yet irresistibly human. One prisoner, a lieutenant from Kyushu who had once commanded a mortar platoon, remembered the endless drills where loyalty had been beaten into them with bamboo sticks. He had been told that Americans were cowards, decadent and weak. But as he watched his men cluster around a comic strip of Popeye gulping spinach, their gaunt cheeks stretched by sudden smiles, he felt something unravel inside. His men were not mocking the enemy. They were connecting with them, recognizing in the lines of ink a universal hunger for levity, for a break from the grind of existence. Even in defeat, even behind wire, the laughter that rose among them carried a weight he could not ignore. It was not the laughter of surrender, it was the laughter of shared humanity. From the towers above, some guards leaned on their rifles, grinning as they watched the scene unfold. They had expected hostility, perhaps silence, perhaps muttered curses. Instead, the camp filled with a murmur of voices, Japanese syllables colliding with bursts of chuckles as comics passed from hand to hand. A Stars and Stripes issue with photographs of the new B-29s made its way down a line of men who had once feared those very aircraft as harbingers of fire from the sky. Now they examined the sleek silhouettes with fascination, tracing their outlines with calloused fingers. The POWs could not read all the words, but the images alone were enough to shake their assumptions. The war was over, and the Americans were not gloating conquerors. They were storytellers, inviting them even briefly into another world. The moon rose above the palms, its silver light mingling with the glow of lanterns strung along the camp fence. The rustle of newsprint echoed faintly as men turned pages again and again, as though afraid the magic might vanish if they stopped. In that moment, a chasm of culture and ideology narrowed, not with treaties or speeches, but with ink and paper. The prisoners had expected punishment, yet received distraction. They had braced for humiliation, yet found humor. And as laughter drifted into the night, even the cicadas seemed to quiet, as if the island itself paused to witness this fragile truce. But beneath the surface of astonishment lingered unease. Could this generosity be trusted? Was it a tactic, a subtle weapon meant to weaken resolve? Many prisoners wrestled with doubt. Yet as the days passed, as more papers arrived, suspicion gave way to reluctant acceptance. Some began sketching their own cartoons on scraps. Others attempted halting translations of headlines, eager to grasp the meaning behind the photographs. It was not just entertainment. It was a window into the mind of their captors. They began to see America not as a faceless machine of war, but as a land of individuals, farmers, factory workers, baseball fans, and children laughing at Donald Duck. This opening act in the drama of captivity revealed a profound truth, though the prisoners could not name it yet. The power of ink, the weight of a newspaper folded and shared, could wound preconceptions as deeply as any bayonet. On that island, in the still summer of 1945, the war had ended not only with mushroom clouds and surrender ceremonies, but with the simple exchange of paper through barbed wire. And for the Japanese soldiers who held those fragile sheets in their hands, it was a shock greater than the thunder of artillery. The shock of discovering that their enemy's greatest weapon might not have been steel or fire at all, but the audacity to share laughter in the ruins of war. September 3rd, 1945. The guns had fallen silent, yet the echoes of war still rippled across oceans and continents. Japan had surrendered only days earlier aboard the USS Missouri, and the world staggered into an uneasy peace. But for tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers now confined in camps across the Pacific and mainland United States, a different battle began. The battle of memory, of humiliation, of grappling with defeat. To understand the shock of newspapers and comics being handed to them, one must step back into the global theater of 1945, when the war's machinery was still cooling, and when ideologies clashed not only on battlefields, but in the minds of men. The Pacific War had been a crucible of extremes. Since Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had raced across Asia, capturing vast territories in a matter of months. Its soldiers were drilled to embody Bushido, the warrior code that demanded sacrifice over surrender. To be captured was the ultimate shame, a living death. Yet by 1943, cracks had begun to show. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, the tide turned. American industry, with its seemingly endless rivers of steel and oil, pressed relentlessly forward. The Imperial Japanese Navy shrank to shadows of its former might, and the skies filled with swarms of American bombers. By 1945, Japan's cities lay in ruins, its people hungry, its armies shattered. The war's end was inevitable, though bitterly resisted until the last. Inside this grand clash of nations lay a gulf of perception. To Japanese soldiers, America was a nation of material excess, a culture soft and indulgent, incapable of true sacrifice. Yet this caricature collapsed in the crucible of battle. The Americans did not fight as the Japanese had imagined. They adapted, they endured, and they fought not only with weapons but with networks of communication, with logistics, with a strange insistence on preserving individual identity even within the machinery of war. Where Japanese soldiers were cut off from the outside world, locked inside a cocoon of military propaganda, American soldiers were immersed in streams of letters, radios, newspapers, and comics, even in foxholes and aboard destroyers. They fought with humor as much as with rifles. By the time surrender came, over 500,000 Japanese troops were scattered in Allied camps, from the Philippines to Hawaii, from Guam to the American Midwest. They arrived broken, their uniforms ragged, their pride crushed. They expected harsh treatment, for that is what they had been told to expect. The Imperial Army's manuals had warned them. The enemy will mock you, starve you, treat you as animals. Yet instead they were fed, clothed, and, most shocking of all, given access to information. The newspapers slipped through the wire carried headlines, not only of victory, but of political debates, sports scores, advertisements for soap and automobiles. Comics featured characters who blundered, who joked, who triumphed in absurdity. It was a stark contrast to the rigid bulletins from Tokyo, which allowed no laughter, no vulnerability, no triviality in the face of war. To understand why this mattered, one must see how information functioned as a weapon. In Tokyo, wartime newspapers had been stripped bare of ambiguity. Every article drummed with purpose, victories magnified, defeats erased, the emperor exalted. It was a language of steel. American papers, by contrast, reflected a society that tolerated doubt, even during existential conflict. To see in Stars and Stripes a headline about congressional arguments or a cartoon lampooning ration shortages was to see a democracy that could laugh at itself. For Japanese soldiers, raised in an environment where questioning authority was treason, this was a revelation. It was not just that Americans had won the war, it was how they had fought it, by keeping alive the spirit of civilian life, even while marching across battlefields. At the strategic level, this divergence mirrored the broader war effort. Japan, stretched thin across a vast empire, fought with dwindling supplies and inflexible doctrine. Its soldiers were expected to endure isolation, to sever ties with home, to exist as extensions of the emperor's will. The United States fought with abundance, not only of tanks and ships but of morale. The average GI was never truly cut off. Radios crackled in every tent, mail flowed constantly, newspapers arrived even on remote islands. Soldiers could remain part of a larger narrative beyond the mud and blood. This continuity of information bound them together, sustained them, and ultimately became one of the war's invisible weapons. The encounter between Japanese prisoners and American newspapers thus crystallized the deeper divide between two visions of war. For the prisoners, holding those pages was to confront not just the enemy's victory, but the very structure of his society. They realized that while their own leaders had demanded silence, the Americans had permitted noise, discordant, humorous, sometimes trivial noise, and that noise had proven powerful. It kept men human. It made defeat survivable. It was in a sense the opposite of Bushido. Where the Japanese way had demanded the erasure of self, the American way embraced it. Yet this was not an easy revelation. Many prisoners resisted. Some scoffed, insisting the newspapers were fakes, carefully staged propaganda. Others turned away, ashamed to feel laughter bubbling within them, while comrades lay in graves across Saipan and Okinawa. The weight of defeat pressed heavily, and humor felt like betrayal. Still, the seed had been planted. With each passing day, as more papers circulated, as more comics changed hands, the reality became unavoidable. The Americans were not as they had been painted. They were not devils or machines. They were men who fought ferociously and yet carried the audacity to laugh. Beyond the camp fences, the world lurched into reconstruction. Europe lay in ruins. Asia bled from wounds still open. The atomic shadows on Hiroshima and Nagasaki cast their long silhouette over the century to come. But inside those camps, among the prisoners who read about baseball scores and Hollywood gossip, the war's conclusion took on another dimension. The battlefield had ended with firestorms, but captivity began with newsprint. For those men, the shock was not merely that they had lost, but that the victors chose to win differently than they had imagined, through connection, through information, through the small yet powerful act of sharing a newspaper. This was the context of their astonishment. The silence after war was broken not by drums or speeches, but by the rustle of pages. And for a generation raised on discipline and denial, that rustle was louder than the crack of rifles, because it told them something their commanders had never admitted, that even in total war, humanity had survived. October 1945. The Pacific camps were quiet at dawn, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath the stillness, the prisoners' minds churned with disbelief, trying to reconcile what they were witnessing. They had seen American soldiers fight with ferocity on the beaches, with overwhelming firepower in the skies, and with ruthless efficiency at sea. That much they had expected. What they had not expected was the hidden edge, the subtle but devastating weapon that could never be measured in steel tonnage or kill ratios. It was not a new tank or aircraft, not even the atomic bomb that had forced Tokyo's hand. It was something far more ordinary, yet infinitely more disruptive to their worldview, access to information, to humor, to the very notion that war could coexist with laughter. For the Japanese prisoners, the revelation came slowly, piece by piece, as they realized that these newspapers and comic books were not anomalies. They were routine, expected, woven into the very fabric of the American war effort. The Stars and Stripes was not some special edition for propaganda. It was a constant presence, delivered across oceans and jungles, ensuring that every GI remained connected to a world beyond the trenches. While Japanese soldiers marched under banners of silence, Americans fought with a chorus of voices in their ears. They carried radios on their backs, tuned into broadcasts that spoke of home. They passed around papers filled with stories from Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. They tucked comics into rucksacks, alongside ammunition and rations. For the first time, Japanese prisoners understood this was not indulgence. This was strategy. The hidden advantage was morale sustained not by command but by culture. American soldiers were never allowed to forget that they were part of a larger story. Even in the mud of Okinawa or the coral reefs of Tarawa, they knew what movies were playing in theaters back home, which baseball team had taken the pennant, which political debates raged in Washington. This constant thread of information reinforced the idea that they fought not just for abstract ideals, but for a living, breathing society still pulsing with daily life. By contrast, Japanese troops were cut off from their families for years at a time, receiving only carefully censored letters that stripped out anything resembling vulnerability. They were told only what their commanders allowed them to know, fed the same slogans, until the words lost meaning. In that vacuum, despair festered. The shock for the prisoners was not just that the Americans had newspapers, but that they gave them away. They shared them. What kind of conqueror would allow the defeated to read his own words, to laugh at his own comics? The act itself was a declaration of confidence. It said, "Our truth is strong enough to be shared even with our enemies." For Japanese soldiers raised on secrecy and control, this openness was incomprehensible. Information in their world had always been a blade to be wielded carefully, kept hidden from foes and even from their own men. To see it treated as casually as food or water shook them to their core. Some prisoners whispered that it was deliberate psychological warfare, and in a way, they were right. But it was not the kind of psychological warfare they expected. It did not break them with terror or starvation. Instead, it dismantled their indoctrination with laughter and curiosity. It forced them to see their captors not as faceless machines, but as men who valued individuality, expression, and the strange resilience of humor. That realization was devastating. If America could fight a total war while still printing cartoons of ducks chasing runaway hats, what did that say about the strength of their society compared to Japan's brittle rigidity? The hidden advantage extended beyond the prison camps. Throughout the war, American forces had wielded communication as a force multiplier. Field radios kept platoons coordinated, newspapers bound entire armies together, and comic strips reminded men of who they were fighting for. When Japanese forces faced American divisions, they often encountered not just superior firepower, but an enemy that fought as if tethered by invisible threads. Orders came swiftly, morale held steady, and even amidst chaos, the Americans carried themselves with a confidence that seemed alien. The prisoners now understood that confidence had been cultivated not only through weapons, but through culture, through the constant reminder that they were part of a nation worth returning to. Inside the camps, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Prisoners who had once sat in sullen silence now gathered in small circles, tracing photographs of baseball players or Hollywood actors, asking guards for translations, even laughing at comic panels they could only half understand. The very act of laughter, the shock of newspapers and comics, was thus more than cultural curiosity. It was the unmasking of an entire system of control. The Japanese soldiers realized that while they had fought with unmatched discipline and sacrifice, they had done so in isolation, cut off from the world they believed they defended. The Americans, by contrast, had fought with connection, with a society that carried on even in the shadow of global conflict. This was the hidden advantage that no amount of Bushido could counter. A war machine fueled not just by steel and oil, but by stories, by laughter, by the audacity to remain human amidst destruction. In the rustle of those papers, the prisoners heard the sound of their defeat in a new light. It was not only that their empire had fallen, it was that their very understanding of war had been upended. The battlefield was not just fought with rifles and bombs, but with words and images, with the subtle power of connection. And as the newspapers continued to circulate, as the comics passed from hand to hand, the prisoners felt the weight of a truth more disorienting than any bomb blast, that the enemy had not only beaten them with force, but with an idea that in modern war, the strength of a nation lay as much in the freedom to laugh as in the will to fight. November 1945. The cold rain of autumn slicked the parade grounds of a converted U.S. Army base in the Philippines. Prisoners huddled beneath patched uniforms, their breath fogging in the damp morning air. Guards made their rounds, rifles slung casually, boots crunching through puddles. But this day was different. A corporal arrived with a canvas sack cradled against his chest. He tipped it over, and the contents spilled like treasure across a wooden table. Radios dismantled and reassembled for demonstration. Prisoners leaned forward, drawn by the gleam of copper coils, the faint smell of warm vacuum tubes, the promise of sound carried across unseen air. To the Japanese, who had marched into jungles with little more than bayonets and whispered orders, this was sorcery. To the Americans, it was ordinary, another tool of war, as common as bread. The heart of the hidden advantage lay in machines like the SCR-300 and SCR-508, names that meant little to the prisoners, but spelled coordination and speed to the Allied armies. The SCR-300, developed by Motorola in 1940, was the world's first practical FM backpack radio. Weighing 35 pounds and strapped like a rucksack, it gave platoon leaders the power to speak across hills, forests, even urban rubble with clarity unheard of in German or Japanese sets. Its range stretched up to 10 miles in open terrain, its voice cutting through static and atmospheric interference. For the Americans, it was the invisible nerve system of the battlefield. Orders traveled not by runners or shouted commands, but on invisible waves of frequency modulation. Entire platoons moved like single organisms. Guided not by instinct alone, but by real-time communication, the SCR-508, mounted in Sherman tanks and half-tracks, carried the same advantage into armored warfare. Its 25 watts of crystal-controlled power reached further and spoke clearer than the German Fuji-5, whose amplitude modulation sputtered with static and garble. Where German crews often lost contact in the thunder of battle, American commanders calmly redirected their units with precision. A tank platoon could wheel, pivot, and strike with uncanny coordination, each machine linked by an invisible lifeline. To the Japanese prisoners staring at the exposed circuits of these radios, the realization was staggering. This was not magic. It was engineering. It was industry. It was America's true weapon. Numbers told the rest of the story. By 1945, U.S. factories had produced over 130,000 SCR-300 units and tens of thousands of vehicle-mounted SCR-508s. Motorola, GE, RCA, giants of the American industrial machine, churned out radios as efficiently as rifles. In contrast, Japanese forces limped along with limited production of the Type 94 and Type 96 radios, devices bulky, fragile, and plagued by unreliable components. Their ranges often shrank to less than 2 miles in rough terrain, their voices swallowed by jungle or mountains. Worse still, scarcity meant few units even received them. A Japanese battalion might march into battle with only a handful of radios, their officers reliant on flags, runners, and bugle calls. Against an enemy stitched together by constant communication, they fought half-blind. The prisoners who once laughed at American comic strips now fell silent as they studied the guts of a radio laid bare. Glass tubes, resistors, wires coiled like veins inside a metallic chest. The guards explained in simple terms, vacuum tubes glowing with life, circuits shaping currents into voices that leapt across the air. It was not sorcery, but science married to mass production. Some prisoners shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered that such abundance was unfair, unnatural. Yet beneath the protest lay grudging admiration. America had not only fielded men and tanks by the thousands, it had given each of them a voice, a tether to command, a link to each other. The technical chasm mirrored the cultural one. In Japanese doctrine, obedience was absolute, initiative rare. Orders descended from above and were followed to the letter, even if circumstances had changed. Radios in American hands enabled something different. They fostered flexibility. A platoon leader pinned by fire could call instantly for artillery. A tank commander lost in smoke could request a new heading. A company cut off in jungle could coordinate an extraction. War became fluid, dynamic, a living organism adjusting to every heartbeat. To fight such an enemy was to fight not one man, not one platoon, but a network of minds bound together by unseen currents. Factories back home fueled the miracle. In Chicago, Motorola's assembly lines hummed day and night, staffed by women in overalls who soldered circuits with steady hands. Detroit, already a giant of automobile production, adapted stamping presses and conveyor belts to build radios as readily as trucks. In Rochester, New York, technicians fine-tuned crystals by the tens of thousands, each one a beating heart for a set destined for Europe or the Pacific. By the war's end, these radios had become so common that soldiers treated them as indispensable as rifles. The Germans had feared American artillery for its accuracy. The Japanese now understood why. Behind every salvo was a radio operator, relaying coordinates in seconds. The prisoners could not help but draw comparisons to their own campaigns. At Guadalcanal, entire companies had been lost in jungle darkness, wandering for days without orders. At Leyte, runners carrying messages had fallen to ambush, leaving units paralyzed in confusion. Even at Okinawa, final defenses had collapsed, not from lack of courage but from silence. Communications severed, commanders isolated, units dying alone in caves. And here before their eyes was the explanation. Radios had stitched the Americans together. Radios had made their advance unstoppable. Radios had been the invisible weapon that crushed them as surely as tanks and bombs. The guards demonstrated one more trick. With a twist of a dial, a voice crackled through, distant yet clear, reporting from another camp on the far side of the island. The prisoners stiffened, astonished. To them, such instantaneous reach was the stuff of fantasy. For the Americans, it was routine. The corporal snapped the set closed with a grin, slinging it over his shoulder like any other tool of the trade. The prisoners exchanged glances heavy with realization. Their empire had been undone not only by bombs and blockades, but by the invisible threads of voice and laughter carried across the ether. As the rain eased and clouds broke, the truth lay bare in the damp air. The Americans had fought not with superior men, nor even superior weapons alone, but with superior connection. And in that connection lay a hidden power greater than any doctrine of sacrifice. The prisoners had glimpsed the inner workings of a machine that was not merely industrial, but human. It was a machine fueled by words, by coordination, by the insistence that no soldier would fight in silence. And for men who had lived and bled in isolation, that realization was as devastating as any shell burst, for it proved that their defeat had been written not just in steel, but in sound. December 1944. Snow fell across the Lorraine countryside, muffling the thunder of artillery. The fields near the French village of Aricourt stretched white and silent beneath a heavy sky, yet beneath that, calm a storm of steel prepared to break. German Panthers, sleek and deadly, crouched at the edge of the woods, their long 75mm guns aimed toward the valley where American Shermans prowled. The stage was set for one of the war's lesser-known but decisive tank engagements. For the Germans, it was meant to be a strike to restore initiative, to remind the Americans of the Panzerwaffe's power. Instead, it became a lesson in how invisible threads of communication could unravel even the most formidable armor. At dawn, the clash began. 39 German Panthers rolled forward, their engines growling, their crews confident. On paper, they outclassed the Shermans they faced. Their armor was thicker, their guns sharper, their optics superior. A single Panther could knock out a Sherman from over a mile, while the Sherman's 75mm gun often needed to flank to even have a chance. The Germans expected another easy harvest. But what they met was something they had not foreseen. Tanks that vanished and reappeared like ghosts, artillery that struck as if guided by unseen eyes, infantry that seemed to know their moves before they made them. Confusion spread faster than fire. American crews were not better trained, nor were their tanks better built. Their advantage was the invisible lifeline of radio. Each Sherman commander carried the SCR 508 at his fingertips, every platoon bound together in a constant stream of updates, warnings, and orders. When one tank spotted Panthers in the mist, his voice leapt instantly across the net, guiding his comrades into ambush positions. When artillery batteries were needed, coordinates flew from tanks to headquarters within seconds. The battlefield became a web, and in that web the Germans found themselves ensnared. Their own Fuji 5 radios sputtered with static, their voices lost in a storm of interference, their commanders isolated at the very moment unity mattered most. The Panthers advanced in waves, yet found themselves firing at ghosts. American tanks slipped from ridge to ridge, communicating every movement, every shift. One unit feigned retreat, drawing the Panthers into open fields. Another circled unseen, striking their flanks with armor-piercing rounds. Artillery rained down with uncanny precision, shells landing where German formations bunched, forcing them to scatter. What the Germans experienced as chaos was, in truth, coordination unfolding at lightning speed. Reports from Panther crews described enemies appearing where none should be, artillery following them relentlessly, and units dissolving under sudden, invisible strikes. It felt less like a battle, and more like being hunted by an enemy who always knew where you were. By day's end, the result spoke with brutal clarity. The Americans destroyed nearly half of the German force. Panthers abandoned, burning, or crippled in the fields. Their own losses were comparatively light. German commanders could not comprehend it. Their tanks were superior, their gunners skilled, their tactics honed by years on the Eastern Front. How then had they been undone by Shermans, machines they dismissed as inferior? The answer lay not in the steel of the tanks, but in the voices carried across radio waves. The Americans had fought as one organism, their coordination multiplying their strength beyond any individual tank. The Germans, cut off and isolated, had fought as scattered fragments, each one brave but blind. After-action reports from the German side reveal frustration bordering on disbelief. One officer wrote that American tanks moved as if guided by a single hand. Another lamented that artillery followed them, as though our positions had been betrayed. In truth, there had been no betrayal, only radios humming in every Sherman, weaving every soldier into the fabric of the fight. The Germans had fought as they always had, relying on centralized command, on orders carried down the chain. But the Americans had reshaped the battlefield into something fluid, something alive, where initiative could spring not just from generals but from sergeants and lieutenants. The result was a new kind of warfare, one where speed of communication outweighed thickness of armor. For the Japanese prisoners who later heard of such battles, the lesson was sobering. They had seen their own defenses crumble at Okinawa, when communication lines were severed, their troops left to die in silence. Now they understood. The Americans had ensured no man, no tank, no platoon would ever be cut off. Radios had turned every engagement into a symphony of coordination, every soldier a note in a larger composition. At Aracourt, that symphony drowned the roar of the Panthers, proving that even the mightiest machine was helpless when blind and alone. The battle also revealed the psychological impact of communication. German crews, accustomed to relying on the strength of their machines, felt a gnawing helplessness as their advantage evaporated. Panic spread when orders failed to arrive, when comrades fell silent on the radio net. By contrast, American crews drew strength from the constant chatter, the reassuring crackle of familiar voices, reminding them they were not alone. Even in moments of fear, they knew someone heard them, someone answered. That knowledge steadied hands and sharpened focus, allowing ordinary men to do extraordinary things. Aracourt was only one battle, but it symbolized a larger truth. Across Europe and the Pacific, the Americans turned inferior machines into victorious forces through the hidden weapon of connection. Japanese POWs, staring at newspapers and comics in their camps, slowly pieced this together. The laughter their captors shared, the casual confidence of their information culture, was not a frivolous luxury. It was the same spirit that had guided Shermans at Aracourt, that had allowed infantry at Normandy to call artillery in minutes, that had let Marines on Iwo Jima coordinate under fire. The hidden advantage was everywhere, and it explained why their own desperate courage had not been enough. The snow melted into mud that December, and the wrecks of panthers smoldered beneath grey skies. Villagers crept back into shattered homes, the fields littered with steel carcasses. To the Germans, it was another bitter defeat in a long retreat. To the Americans, it was proof of doctrine, proof that radios, mass production, and coordination could defeat even the deadliest armor. And to the Japanese prisoners who later heard of such encounters, it was an omen that their empire, built on silence and sacrifice, had never stood a chance against a nation that carried not only rifles, but voices that bound every soldier into one. Spring 1945. The Pacific Islands smoldered with the scars of war. On Okinawa, the ground shook beneath barrages that never seemed to end, and on Iwo Jima, black volcanic ash still bore the imprint of desperate charges. For Japanese soldiers, the war had been a crucible of silence. Cut off from their homeland, their commanders killed or communications severed, units withered in caves and tunnels, dying not from cowardice, but from isolation. For Americans, the same battles unfolded with a different rhythm. Crackling radios linked foxholes to artillery, tanks to infantry, and platoons to commanders. Even amidst the chaos, American units adapted, shifted, and reformed. What the Japanese prisoners realized as they sat with newspapers and comics in their hands was more than cultural curiosity. It was the dawning comprehension of a strategic and psychological divide that had determined their fate. The difference was not only in weapons, but in how men experienced the war. American soldiers, even in the filth of trenches, never felt truly alone. The voice on the radio reminded them they were part of something larger. They fought with the knowledge that reinforcements could be called, that their positions could be supported, that their sacrifice would not vanish into silence. For Japanese troops, the opposite held true. When a commander fell, when lines of communication were severed, men were left adrift. They died bravely, but they died in fragments. The collapse of cohesion was not a failure of courage, but a failure of connection. Psychologically, the effect was profound. German officers had marveled and cursed how American platoons could recover after losing leaders. Radios allowed instant reassignment of command. A sergeant's voice could cut through static and assume control where a lieutenant had fallen. By contrast, Axis forces often collapsed when commanders were killed. The chain of command severed like a rope. Japanese soldiers, trained to obey orders without question, found themselves paralyzed when those orders ceased. In caves on Okinawa, entire units simply sat in silence, awaiting commands that never came until starvation or grenades ended their vigil. The Americans, bound by constant chatter, refused to be paralyzed. Their cohesion lived in voices, not in hierarchy. The prisoners came to see that the laughter they heard in comics and newspapers was not trivial. It was armor. To smile, to laugh, even to complain about shortages or poke fun at politicians, was to remain human in a war designed to dehumanize. For the Americans, humor did not weaken resolve. It fortified it. Soldiers passed around cartoons of Popeye or Beetle Bailey and felt a thread of home woven into the battlefield. That emotional resilience was invisible on maps, absent in war plans, yet decisive in combat. Japanese soldiers, denied such outlets, relied only on discipline and fanaticism. When discipline cracked, nothing replaced it. When fanaticism collided with the reality of overwhelming force, it collapsed. The Americans, by contrast, fought with a deeper reservoir. The ability to endure not only with courage, but with connection to something beyond the battlefield. Strategically, this shaped entire campaigns. In Europe, German after-action reports spoke with bitter respect of American artillery, its speed, its precision, its apparent omniscience. What they did not fully grasp was that radios had made every soldier an observer, every platoon a set of eyes feeding the guns. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders could not fathom how quickly American units adapted, reinforcing weak points or shifting attacks. They did not realize that voices carried those adjustments in minutes, not hours. The advantage was not steel against steel, but information against silence. It was a doctrine of speed, flexibility, and resilience, contrasted against rigidity, obedience, and isolation. The prisoners wrestled with this revelation. Some clung to pride, insisting that American abundance of technology was unfair, that Japanese soldiers had fought with purer spirit. Yet others could not ignore the truth. Spirit alone could not overcome the crushing weight of connection. They thought back to their own campaigns, battles where courage had been plentiful, yet victory absent. Courage could not summon artillery in minutes. Courage could not relay positions across valleys. Courage could not sustain men in caves cut off from orders. Radios, newspapers, and comics had done what courage could not. They had bound men together. The psychological toll of this divide extended beyond the battlefield. German crews reported demoralization when their radios failed, when isolation crept in. Japanese soldiers experienced that isolation constantly. The silence was their normal state, their only state. By contrast, American soldiers were sustained by a constant stream of voices and words, commanders issuing orders, comrades cracking jokes, newspapers reminding them that a world of family, sport, and politics still existed. That difference created not just stronger armies, but stronger individuals. The American GI could fight knowing that his struggle was witnessed, his name remembered, his letters answered. The Japanese soldier often fought knowing only that he would die unseen, forgotten except in the abstraction of sacrifice. For the POWs, this truth was devastating. To admit it was to admit that their empire had failed not only in arms, but in spirit. They had been told that the emperor's army embodied the pinnacle of sacrifice, that their willingness to die made them invincible. Yet the Americans had proven otherwise, that survival, not death, was the greater weapon. That to fight with voices, laughter, and connection was more powerful than to fight in silence. It was a revelation that gnawed at them, reshaping their understanding of the war long after the battles had ended. The guards who passed newspapers through the wire could not have known the depth of the impact. To them it was routine, a simple gesture to ease boredom. To the prisoners, it was revelation, a window into the hidden advantage that had crushed their empire. Every headline, every comic panel, every box score was proof that America fought not as individuals, but as a network, each man a node in a larger web. That web had strangled their armies, undermined their doctrines, and shattered their faith. And in the quiet of the camps, as the newspapers rustled under lantern light, the prisoners began to understand that the true battlefield had not been only land, sea, or air. It had been connection itself. For them, the psychological impact of defeat deepened. They were not merely beaten by bombs and bullets. They were beaten by something more subtle, more insidious, a society that refused to surrender its laughter, its communication, its humanity. And that, more than any weapon, was the lesson that haunted them as the war slipped into memory. August 1945 had closed with surrender, but its echoes stretched far beyond Tokyo Bay. In prison camps across the Pacific and even on American soil, Japanese soldiers sat with newspapers and comics in their hands, still wrestling with disbelief. They had been conditioned to see surrender as dishonor, to believe that capture stripped a man of his humanity. Yet in those fragile sheets of paper, they discovered the opposite. Their captors treated them not as shadows but as men, men allowed to read, to laugh, to glimpse a world beyond barbed wire. The legacy of that revelation would ripple outward, shaping not only how these prisoners remembered the war, but how the world prepared for wars yet to come. The immediate impact was cultural. Prisoners carried home the memory of American openness, of laughter coexisting with war. Many would later describe to their families how strange it felt to hold a comic book, while still wearing the uniform of a defeated soldier. Some never admitted it publicly, but privately they acknowledged the power of that experience. It cracked the armor of propaganda they had worn for years. It made them question why their own leaders had denied them such simple comforts, why their own newspapers had been stripped of humanity. In post-war Japan, as democracy took root under Allied occupation, these memories became seeds. Newspapers flourished once more, not as weapons of state, but as voices of society. Comics too exploded into cultural life, manga becoming one of Japan's most enduring contributions to global culture. The irony was stark. Men who had once laughed at Donald Duck behind barbed wire returned home to raise children who would one day laugh at Astro Boy. Strategically, the lesson of connection became a cornerstone of modern warfare. Military planners across the world recognized that radios and information networks had been as decisive as tanks and bombers. German generals admitted it openly. "We built better tanks, but they built tanks that fought together." Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel himself reflected that coordination had defeated armor. Japanese officers, in turn, conceded that silence had doomed them as surely as shortages of oil and steel. When the Cold War dawned, both East and West invested heavily not just in weapons, but in systems of communication. The invisible threads that bound American GIs in 1944 would become the digital webs of satellites and encrypted networks in decades to come. By the Gulf War of 1991, the principle had matured into doctrine. American tanks crossed deserts not as isolated machines, but as nodes in a vast digital network. Pilots flew sorties guided by real-time data, commanders watched battle unfold on screens, and soldiers carried radios small enough to clip to their belts. The lesson Japanese POWs had glimpsed in 1945, that connection outweighs raw firepower, had become the very skeleton of modern war. Information supremacy was no longer a hidden advantage. It was the decisive factor, and its lineage traced back to the rustle of stars and stripes inside prison camps, to the laughter of men who discovered that war could coexist with humor. Yet the legacy was not only technical. It was human. For the veterans who returned home, American and Japanese alike, the memory of newspapers and comics carried a deeper meaning. For Americans, it was proof that they had fought not just with steel but with spirit. They had preserved their humanity amidst destruction. For Japanese prisoners, it was a lesson in humility. They had been beaten not by demons, but by men who refused to surrender the essence of life. That realization lingered long after the war. Some veterans spoke of it with bitterness, others with admiration. But none forgot the shock of seeing their captors laugh. And so as the century turned, the voices of the past still echoed. In the hum of radios, in the glow of screens, in the endless flow of words and images, one truth remained. Humanity's greatest weapon is not the bomb, nor the tank, nor the plane. It is the ability to speak, to share, to connect. The Japanese prisoners who once trembled at the touch of an American newspaper had glimpsed this truth in its rawest form. They had seen that laughter could bridge even barbed wire, that comics could wound propaganda deeper than bullets, that newspapers could be mightier than swords. The war had ended with firestorms and mushroom clouds, but its most enduring lesson was quieter. It was the rustle of paper, the flicker of ink, the sound of laughter rising from men who had once sworn to die before surrender. And from that lesson came a truth that would shape every war to follow. In modern conflict, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. The battlefield may change, the weapons may evolve, but the essence endures. Humanity survives not by silence, but by voices carried across the dark.